Hello everyone, welcome to my channel. I'm really excited to bring you today's video. If you enjoy my content, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. Let's get started. The year was 1972, one of the most intense periods of the Vietnam War. Battles raged across the country and villages and towns were gradually engulfed by the effects of war. People tried to continue their daily lives while constantly being on edge, prepared for the ever-changing circumstances. Ho Van Than, as usual, woke up early that morning and prepared to go work in the fields. His son, Ho Van Lang, was still very young and stayed home with his mother. The tension that had been building for days was putting immense pressure on everyone in the village. People kept asking each other, "Will everything go well today?" But no one knew the answer. That day, something unexpected happened. A loud noise echoed over the village, and Than felt that everything around him was being pulled into chaos. People were running in all directions, trying to find safety. In that moment, Than had only one thought: to find his family and protect them. He quickly headed toward his home, but the sight he encountered deeply shook him. His house had been destroyed, and panicked people were fleeing in every direction. His heart raced. He searched through the rubble with his eyes for his family. Just then he spotted his young son trembling in fear in a corner. Lang, too young to fully understand what was happening, had terror on his face that spoke volumes. Than picked up his son and held him tightly. He had to quickly regain his composure and take him to a safe place. They couldn't stay here anymore. Life in the village was no longer possible, and though they didn't know where to go, their only option was to flee into the forest. With his son on his back, Than began making his way into the forest. The village they had left behind was now just a memory. The surroundings were quiet, with only the sound of the wind rustling the leaves of the trees. His son sat silently on his back. Although he didn't yet understand what had happened, he felt that his father would protect him. That first night they sought shelter under a tree and tried to sleep. The forest at night was frightening. The whisper-like animal sounds, mysterious movements, and glowing eyes in the darkness. Than stayed alert, not once closing his eyes, always ready to protect his son. They had nothing, no food, no shelter. The next day they set out in search of food. Than had to learn what nature had to offer. Which fruits were edible, which plants were harmless. Hunger didn't forgive impatience, and they had to learn to live in harmony with nature to survive. When they found water by the stream, Than realized at least they wouldn't die of thirst. Over time, Than started building a small shelter. Using large leaves and tree branches, he constructed a safe haven for his son. Although this new life was filled with uncertainties, he had to be strong for his son. The forest they were now in was no longer just a place of escape. It had become their new home. They had to learn how to survive here. Than sensed that this would be a long journey, but for his son Lang, no matter what, he would continue. And so, in the deep forests of Vietnam, began a struggle for survival and loneliness that would last 40 years. Ho Van Than and his son Ho Van Lang were now completely cut off from civilization. Deep in the forest, far from people, they took steps toward an unknown life. The first days were the hardest. They had to fight against hunger, thirst, and the uncertainties of the wild nature. Than had some basic survival knowledge from the past, but living in the forest for a long time was a different experience altogether. They had to stay on guard at all times and learn what nature had to offer. Lang was still very young. As days passed, he started learning by watching how his father adapted to nature. For a child in his play age, the forest was filled with dangers, but for him, there was no other choice. The forest had become their new home. The first big challenge father and son faced was finding food. Than began exploring what nature had to offer. He first had to identify the edible fruits and plants. Some plants could be poisonous, while others could harm the body. One day, Lang found a bright red fruit and was about to put it in his mouth. His father quickly stopped him because brightly colored fruits in nature could often be poisonous. From that day on, Lang started paying more attention to his father's words. A few days later, Than noticed fish swimming by a riverbank. Hunger had become unbearable, and he needed to find a solution. He took a few large rocks and threw them into the water to drive the fish toward the shore. He quickly gathered the small fish that washed up on the shore and felt the joy of filling his stomach with something they had caught from nature for the first time. Over time, relying solely on plants and fish wasn't enough. They needed to learn to hunt larger animals. Thon had heard some things about hunting while living in the village, but he had never experienced it himself. He started following the tracks of small animals in the forest. With the footprints, broken branches, and feathers on the ground, he learned to understand where certain animals were roaming. In the beginning, he tried to set traps with his hands but was unsuccessful. Later, he began making primitive bows and arrows from tree branches to hunt small rabbits and birds. His son Lang learned these skills by watching his father. Within a few years, Than had fully transformed into a hunter. His son Lang followed, in his footsteps, carefully observing the weapons and traps his father made. Lang's connection to nature was even stronger, because he had been born and raised in this life. Realizing they would stay in the forest for a long time, Than began making clothes from natural materials. At first, they wore the old clothes they had brought with them, but over time those wore out and ripped apart. Than worked with large tree leaves and bark to create garments. Lang grew up in these clothes, and they began to seem completely normal to him. They didn't have shoes, so they made something resembling sandals from tough tree fibers. As the days passed and their survival tools improved, life became a little easier. They made water containers from bamboo reeds, sharp knives from stones, and more durable shelters. For Lang, this life began to feel quite natural. As his father taught him how nature worked, he grew up as a child of the forest. Over the years, father and son had completely adapted to nature. Everything that existed in the modern world had become meaningless to them. As Lang grew older, he never attended school, never used anything that ran on electricity. He had no knowledge of cars, phones, or televisions. His world consisted only of the forest, the sunrise, hunting, tree leaves, wild animals, and what his father had taught him. For years they lived without seeing another human face. They didn't know that one day they would return to civilization. For them, the world consisted only of the two of them and the eternity of the forest. And so, Ho Van Lang became one of the rare people to grow up completely cut off from the modern world. Neither Ho Van Than nor his son Ho Van Lang had noticed how time had passed. 40 years had gone by in the forest. Growing up with his father's teachings, Lang knew nothing of the concepts of the modern world. He lived by the unique rules of the forest. His days were spent hunting, reinforcing their shelter and integrating with nature. However, this peaceful isolation would unexpectedly come to an end in 2013. Some villagers from the Quang Ngai region of Vietnam had been telling stories of two mysterious figures who had been wandering in the forest for years, sometimes moving like shadows from a distance, other times disappearing quickly. These people had even become the subject of local legends. Some believed these people might be soldiers who had gone missing in the war, while others thought they were members of an old tribe who had merged into the wild. One day, a few villagers, out hunting, discovered an old, primitive shelter among the thick trees. Made of bamboo and leaves, the shelter gave the impression that someone was still living there. There were charred wood pieces and a few primitive tools around it. As the curious villagers wandered around the shelter, suddenly, a shadow moved. An old man with a long beard appeared from behind the leaves. Alongside him was another man, young and with nervous eyes, who resembled his father. The villagers froze in astonishment upon seeing them. These two men, with faces tanned by the sun, and hair and beards tangled together, looked as though they were outside of time. But what was even more surprising was the fear they showed upon seeing the villagers. Ho Van Lang was seeing other people for the first time in his life. Since his childhood, he had never come into contact with anyone other than his father. For him, people were not part of the world he knew. His father, Than, although very old, remained cautious. He didn't know who these people were. Unaware that the war had ended, he was trying to figure out whether they were enemies. The villagers, attempting to calm them, slowly approached. However, Lang, terrified, pulled back. He was a child of the wild, and he did not trust people. He clung to his father and saw them as a threat. The villagers reported the situation to the authorities. The next day, A group of officials, guides, and villagers returned to the forest. Their goal was to safely bring these two men back to civilization. When the officials and villagers reached the area of the shelter, Ho Van Than and Lang had not left. But they were even more frightened by the crowd. Lang didn't know how to react to these unfamiliar people. Acting on his instinct to protect his son, Than tried to defend himself with a sharpened bamboo stick. This man, who had lived an isolated life for years, had forgotten how to trust people. The officials approached with a calming manner, trying to explain that they meant no harm. Although Than struggled to recall his language, he realized they were not a threat related to the war. However, for Lang, everything was much more frightening. Beside his father, he looked around with fearful eyes. For him, there was no world beyond the forest. Who were these people? Their strange clothes, the shiny objects they carried? None of it was familiar to him. Eventually, the officials managed to guide them out of the forest without using force. Father and son left the forest for the first time in 40 years and stepped into the modern world. But outside, a much larger unknown awaited them. The authorities and villagers had been slowly trying to bring these two men out of the forest after 40 years. Ho Van Than and his son Lang did not want to leave the wild nature that was the only world they had known since birth. Father Than had survived by his own rules and labor for years. Leaving the forest for him wasn't just about moving to a different place. It meant leaving behind his entire life. When he looked at his son, he could see that Lang felt the same fear. Since childhood, Lang had only known his father and nature. For him, these people, their speech, movements, clothes, and strange belongings were completely foreign. He felt as though they were a danger that should be hidden from his world. But Than's health was deteriorating. His old body could no longer resist the fatigue accumulated over the years. When the authorities offered him medical help for the first time, he paused. He realized that he needed to take a step into the outside world for the first time in years. Their resistance didn't last long. Father and son were reluctantly taken out of the forest. Lang was walking on a wide, open road for the first time. Skyscrapers, cars, electric poles, and large signs. His eyes widened as he looked at everything with fear and curiosity. For someone who had grown up without ever seeing a village or town, suddenly being thrust into the modern world was a huge shock. When he saw cars zooming past him, he pulled back, feeling as if enormous creatures were coming toward him. The sounds of engines, horns, and the noise of the crowd were a confusing chaos that he couldn't make sense of. When he saw buildings lit up by electric lights, he tried to understand what these bright things were. He turned to his father and asked, but even Than had forgotten some of these things. The authorities first took them to a hospital. Lang, trying to adjust to the white walls and bright lights he had never seen before, was tense. To him, these enclosed spaces seemed dull and strange compared to the endless freedom of the forest. Doctors examined Than's health. His weakened body showed the signs of many years of harsh living. Malnutrition, age-related diseases, and the effects of living outdoors for so long indicated that he now needed modern medical care. Lang, for the first time, saw other people touch him. The doctors took his pulse and conducted some tests. He looked at his father with fear. When he realized they weren't going to leave him alone, he felt a little more at ease but was still on edge. While Than rested in the hospital, the authorities provided him with some information about the past. When they told him the war had ended, his eyes filled with tears. To learn that the thing he had been fleeing from for decades was actually already over, this information created a huge void inside him. He asked himself, did we really have to live in the forest for 40 years with my son? Throughout all this time, perhaps he had been scared for nothing. Perhaps he had unnecessarily isolated himself and his son from the outside world. But in a way, maybe he had to do it. Because outside the forest, nothing was waiting for him anymore. Nothing would ever be the same. A few days later, Lang was taken out of the hospital and placed in a house. Everything was new to him. When he saw a television, for the first time he stepped back in fear, thinking there were people inside. He tried to touch it, but when he didn't see his hand pass through the screen, he was stunned. He saw water flowing from a faucet for the first time. First, he touched the water, then realized he could drink it. He had only known water from streams and rain in his life. Here, water flowed automatically when needed. One day, when food was served to him already cooked, he didn't know what to do. Food cooked in a pan or on a stove were things he had never seen in nature. He had always hunted his own food and consumed it directly with his hands. When he lay on a bed for the first time, he noticed how soft the ground was. But for him, a hard surface was what he was used to. He woke up several times during the night, longing for the free sky of the forest. Lang didn't know how to talk to people. To him, people spoke too quickly and used too many words. Most of the time, he tried to communicate by just nodding. A few times, he wanted to return to the forest. He wanted his father to go with him, but Than was now too old. Living in the forest had become impossible for him. One day, Lang asked his father, "Dad, should we go back?" But Than, with a deep sigh, looked at his son and shook his head. "We are here now," he said. Lang realized he was in the middle of a huge transformation. He had to try to stay in the modern world. But for him, this new world was not going to be an easy place. For Ho Van Lang and his father Ho Van Thang, who had lived as part of the wild nature for 40 years, returning to the modern world was much harder than expected. After spending a few weeks in the hospital, the authorities decided to settle the father and son in a village in Quang Ngai, Vietnam. A small house was prepared for them. Their basic needs were met, and they were assisted in adapting to modern life. However, for Lang, this new life was not easy. One of the first major changes for Lang was wearing clothes. Since he was born in the forest, the concept of clothing had no meaning for him. He had lived for years wearing coverings made from tree bark. When the authorities gave him normal clothes, he didn't even understand their purpose. When he first wore a shirt and pants, he felt uncomfortable and constricted. He thought the fabric wrapped around his body and limited his movements. For a while, he resisted wearing clothes. Only when he saw his father wearing them did he get somewhat convinced. But every chance he got, he wanted to return to the old habits where he felt more comfortable. Lang had never spoken to anyone except his father in his life. For him, language was just a practical tool, and long conversations or communicating with people was not something he was used to. The villagers tried to talk to him, but Lang often only nodded his head instead of responding. He listened carefully to their words, but most of the time he couldn't fully understand what they were saying. After a while, he began to learn the simplest words. He tried to say words like yes, no, and thank you. But forming full sentences was impossible for him. When people spoke to him, he often looked away and anxiously stared at the ground. The sheer number of people in the modern world bothered him because he was used to living only with his father and nature in the forest. Lang was shocked when he was introduced to modern food. In the forest, he had only consumed the animals he hunted, the fruits he gathered, and drinking water. Now plates filled with cooked spiced food in various flavors were placed in front of him. When he was first given a plate of rice and vegetables, he touched it and smelled it. When he didn't recognize the smells he was used to in nature, he hesitated to eat the food, but his biggest shock came when he ate something sweet. One day they gave him a piece of sugary dessert. He took a small bite and instantly, his face changed. He had never tasted sugar in his life, and this flavor opened the door to an entirely different world for him. Over time, he became accustomed to some foods, but nothing felt like the natural foods in the forest. Sometimes, he would look around and feel a strong desire to return to the forest. After they settled in the village, Father Than quickly started losing his strength. He had been physically strong in the forest, but now his body couldn't adapt to the changes in the modern world. He had endured harsh weather conditions for years, survived on natural foods, and lived a completely different life. Now, despite the medical treatments offered by modern medicine, his body was rapidly failing. Soon he began to fall ill and was confined to bed. Lang stayed by his side, taking care of him. But his father no longer had the strength he once did. One day, Dang looked at his son with teary eyes and slowly took his hand. There was a sadness in his eyes. It seemed as though he was feeling both the sorrow of leaving his son alone in the modern world and the regret of the 40 years that had passed. Even though he now knew the war was over, And soon after, Hovan Than passed away. When his father died, everything became even harder for Lang. He had lived his whole life only with his father. In the modern world, everything was foreign to him, and he didn't know if he belonged there without his father. At the funeral, the villagers tried to support him. However, he stood there without saying anything. He silently mourned his father's loss, but he couldn't express it to anyone. That night, as he slept alone in the house, he felt for the first time that he was truly alone. Even in the forest, his father had always been by his side. But now, he was completely on his own. After that night, Lang began to feel like he didn't belong anywhere, neither in the modern world nor in the forest. For him, the hardest times were just beginning. For Hovan Lang, being alone in the modern world was much more difficult than the solitude he had experienced in the forest. After his father's death, he truly felt alone for the first time. The man who had shared everything with him, taught him how to survive, and guided him through life was no longer there. The villagers tried to help him. They invited him to eat with their families, and they supported him in adapting to the modern world. But for Lang, the modern world was a confusing place he couldn't make sense of. In the forest, everything had been simple: hunt, find water, build shelter, and live in harmony with nature. But here people talked on phones, watched television, and used electric appliances. In this world, Lang didn't even know where he fit in. Lang noticed that people woke up in the morning, went to work, ate meals at certain times, and lived their days according to specific rules. But he couldn't adapt to this rhythm. He tried to watch television. However, he had difficulty understanding the moving people and places on the screen. It felt as if there was another reality there, but it didn't belong to his world. Where did those people live? Were they real, or was it some kind of magic? When someone gave him a phone, he tried to figure out how to use it. However, hearing sounds from a screen and seeing images change when pressing buttons felt completely magical to him. Technology was foreign to him, and it meant nothing to him. One day, a villager played him a radio. When music started playing, he was astonished. The sound was coming from inside a box, but there was no one there. How could this be possible? These experiences were not only surprising to Lang, but also frightening. In the forest, everything was natural. But here, the world created by humans was in a completely different order. Every time Lang felt like a stranger in the modern world, he was filled with the desire to return to the forest. He tried to run away and go back to the forest several times. However, he was no longer as strong as before, and he was brought back before he could get too far from the village. For him, the forest was the only place for freedom and peace. Here, people talked too much, demanded too much, and were constantly trying to keep up with something. But in nature, everything had a rhythm, and humans were not forced to do anything. A few times he forced himself to hunt and find food in nature like in his old days, but his habits had already been lost. His body had become weak, and after years of isolation, it had changed. He was neither truly part of the modern world nor able to return to the forest. Lang spent the final years of his life quietly in the village. He spoke as little as possible to people and often preferred to be alone. The villagers brought him food and took care of him, but he longed for the life where he could fend for himself, just like in the forest. In 2021, at the age of 52, he fell ill. Doctors wanted to offer him modern medical treatment, but Lang showed no interest. He had lived as part of nature, and he wanted to die as part of it as well. And one day, he silently passed away. Hovan Lang's story went down in history as the tragic tale of a man who grew up completely isolated from the modern world, and one day learned that everything had changed. He was a living example of modernity and the human disconnection from nature. His life became one of the rare stories showing how much a person could adapt to nature, but also how alienated they could feel when they returned to the modern world. Lang could neither return to the old life he had been born into in the forest, nor fully adapt to the modern world. And in the end, he passed away as a man trapped between both worlds.